Thank you. Thank you, Michael, so much. And thanks to Books Are Magic for hosting us. Thanks to everyone for being here tonight, especially the authors. I've been really, really excited for this panel. I wanted to start it off by talking about why I chose the theme of unraveling. What better word to describe 2020? I feel like we've dealt with so much loss this year, with the pandemic only being the tip of the iceberg. But we've also seen pain and anger transformed into action. Even more people participating in and supporting the Black Lives Matter movement, and a new urgency to vote Trump out of the White House. So I'm wondering, for each of the authors here, what does unraveling mean to you right here in this moment in time, and also in your own work as a writer? Whoever wants to go first.
So I think for me, unraveling in this moment, I mean, I think it means sort of being human, allowing yourself space to feel and to, I think Jim Yattenberg actually wrote a really, really wonderful essay about resilience recently, and like making room for to not be resilient, making room to feel things and be human and allow yourself rest. But also I think there's an element of unraveling that kind of strips away performance and pretense in a way that is sad, because it's a survival response, I think. So that's how I feel about this moment, where I'm both trying to survive and also remain intact, but leaving room for leaving space for a human response to this pressure. But in writing, I think unraveling is something I try to harness on the page, where I also want to make room for my characters to, I don't know, to be human. I guess I keep saying that, but to feel and be situated fully in their human bodies, and I don't know, and respond in a way that allows room for contradiction even. So I think it's a number of things in real life versus on the page.
Yeah, I mean, I very much identify with what you said, Raven, just in terms of, I guess, writing has always been, for me, the place where I feel like I can be most fully myself with the gamut of my emotions. I think in part because, like I grew up in a household that was extremely tumultuous. I had very young parents who both had severe addiction problems. And so I feel like in life, sort of like keeping everything together and not like not losing control has been a really, really entrenched coping mechanism for me. So it's actually just super hard for me to cope with, with unforeseen circumstances, with, like with events that test my emotions. But when I write, I feel like that's where, like whether or not I'm writing something personal or I'm writing about the stories of other people, that's where I feel like I'm able to harness those emotions and be, kind of like a more unraveled version of myself, and a more vulnerable person, which I think is something that has been really key to me, to me feeling more like my complete self, rather than this sort of person who is, keeping everything together, yet actually has all of these feelings and emotions that are unaddressed or unresolved, right?
I'll jump in. We're all kind of waiting when to jump in. It's something one, gracias for having me. And this is, it's a very generous to be in this space with you all, and also to be able to think about anything with a point, right? And some of what doesn't feel like it has any, I'm always looking for texture. And of course, being a poet, and in some ways I feel like I'm among, every one of you is a poet. and some of you more so than others. I'm thinking a lot about the word itself and just the contradiction of the word, that it is at once an unraveling that is also leading to a new raveling. It used to be, I think it was like another word for was like out raveled or something. So I guess I've been thinking a little bit about the fact that we live in a condition of ravel. We live in a condition of unraveling, and some of what has been really difficult, and not that this moment isn't different, but in some ways we've moved away from our ability to shift and change. I feel that way a lot being involved with the institution and the academy, and yet every one of our peoples have done that over time. It's like you take in energy and you reorganize it and you put it out in a new way. And so one of the ways that I've been thinking about it, and I believe it's the way I come to my work on the page, and it's the way I come to the classroom, and the way I try to, move through the small increments of my day, is to understand that I will necessarily unravel, and where I can be my best self is to learn how to re-ravel, so that every untangling gives me an opportunity to re-entangle in new ways that I really feel the need to do that now is what does it mean for me to be a poet? What does it mean for me to be a daughter, to be a lover, to be a teacher? And so for me, in a way, I'm trying to figure out what is the momentum or rhythm of unraveling or even raveling, and how can I somehow make that a forward motion or a valuable motion of return. Some of the ways I'm thinking about it.
Go ahead.
I was going to jump in because as a poet, I did sort of leave my comfort zone of being very much in my own head when I wrote The Unreality of Memory. I started writing it in 2016. I wonder if that's true for any of the rest of you with these new books. I had this kind of recentering of my priorities, and I felt this great urgency to respond to the moment and really immerse myself in this kind of material of the moment, but also, what I saw as like historical precedents for what's happening now. And it was partly driven by great fear. I was just absolutely full of fear all of 2016, not just after the election. I thought, well, that can't possibly happen, but I was afraid of it, still so afraid of it. And then it did happen, and I had to come to terms with the fact that I thought, oh, it wouldn't actually happen. It still seemed impossible. So I was writing a lot about disasters and apocalypse. And, the longer I went through the process of writing it, the more I felt like I was unraveling. The last essays were the hardest to write, absolutely. And I lost my ability to sleep. I was just like physically in pain, and I couldn't really imagine things getting worse. And they did. Like right around when I finished, like completely finished the book, turned in my final edits, that was when everything was going into lockdown. So, and I had already kind of come to this place where I was like, okay, I'm done with all this disaster stuff. I want to get back to my comfort zone. I want to write poems again. I want to write literary criticism. I want to just read books and think about beautiful paragraphs. So yeah, now I'm a little bit lost. Things certainly got worse. It's funny how relative suffering is in a way. How when you're suffering, you think, well, this is suffering. This is a 10, right? But like the truth is, you don't know what 10 is. You could be at a 4, but it feels like a 10 to you, and maybe later you'll find out what a 5 is, much less a 10. So yeah, I think I'm just constantly, to kind of echo Natalie, unraveling and then re-raveling, unraveling, re-raveling, feeling like this is as bad as it gets, and then collecting myself and feeling like, okay, I can handle things again. I know what to do now. I know how to be a person. I know how to be a writer. And then it all falls away.
So it's interesting hearing you talk about, you know, the scale of suffering and things like that. I think that's one of the reasons that it's so important to have other people in our lives and other experiences in my life. I know it's been true that there are people who, I really rely on the people who've been through wars, who've been through hard things, who've been through big social movements, but, you know, through like COINTELPRO years. I mean, like all of those things give me a sense of strength and resilience because they're still here and they can tell those stories, and that's part of it. And so that's, I think, you know, I consider it personally, it's something that if something can go from an 8 to a 4, I'm more human for that. I'm part of the human experience more deeply in my way, I think, from that. But it is, you know, it's been a rough years, and my publisher would shoot me if I didn't say I also have a new book out. It's called The Great Offshore Grounds. And it was also really hard to write during this time because I was deeply conflicted about whether I should be writing at all versus organizing. I've also worked as a labor organizer and done a lot of other things. And so that question of, you know, where do I put my labor and what is art and like, what am I doing with it? Was part of the unraveling for me in the process of writing. As events would happen, I would just, you know, completely spin out going, this is not, how can I say that what's in front of me is the most important thing I should be doing right now, you know, as opposed to every other thing I could be doing. I found it very hard to come back to the page in that sense. I mean, I could always had a strong discipline with it, but I found it hard to bring my heart back and feel like, okay, no, showing beauty is important. Like showing, you know, these things that are less immediate, they're still important. And I had to go back and forth and do that a bunch with the novel. What I think though about Unraveling, as I'm thinking about it now, and is that there's this balance between vulnerability and scrutiny, because part of the issue of Unraveling is that you're becoming vulnerable, but there's also sort of, we're in a culture of scrutiny as well, right? Because that's a natural part of deciding, picking everything up and deciding, do we want to keep this? Do we want to throw it away, right? Like, and everybody's kind of doing that in different ways. And there's painful sides of that, and there's beautiful sides of that, but that vulnerability and that scrutiny are right there at the same time. So as you unravel, you're in a state of danger, and you're also in a state of becoming. And so for me and my work, that a lot of it comes down to looking at history, at economics, at people, at their lives, at addictions, at all sorts of things. And one of the questions that I think my characters have and that I have all the time is, you know, when I'm watching something unravel, I'm going, well, do I grab that thread and yank it really hard? Is it better to just, you know, get that sucker going? Or do I want to sort of like, you know, try to go the other way? And that question of like, how much are we like taking this thing down versus how much we're going to go like, hold on, let's start spooling on the other end of this really quickly. Like those are questions for art and questions for citizenry in ways to me that are connected. And so yeah, I think that's kind of what I have to say about Unraveling. I feel like there's a lot of unraveling in my life and in my art and in my, I'm glad to be politically unfixed, because it is, if we think that we can take an ideology of any kind and a dogma and just throw it on top of this moment and come together as people, we're wrong. And so I'm trying to remember and have some humility about that. In the writing and in my living. So anyway,
Thank
that's
you.
Thank
you. I love all of these answers. Elisa, in your eerily prescient essay, The Great Mortality, which is in The Unreality of Memory, you write about the Black Death, and I'm going to quote here from your essay. You say, as William H. McNeill writes in Plagues and Peoples, the plague on some level was a routine crisis of human life. Many at this time seem to take this mass die-off in stride, like the weather. It's paradoxical how quickly we adapt to suffering. You also say later on in the essay that every plague is a double plague of contagion and fear. And I've noticed how much has been normalized during COVID-19, you know, wearing masks, disinfecting groceries, carrying hand sanitizer everywhere we go. These things have become routine to so many of us, but I can't adapt to the suffering. I'll never forget walking past a hospital here in Brooklyn back in May and seeing a refrigerated truck they were using as a makeshift morgue. And I had seen that, I had seen photos on the news, but seeing it in person, it was just absolutely terrifying. That's what I felt in that moment, was just sheer terror. And I'm wondering what you've learned about the way people cope with pandemics, both in your research for this book and your lived experience over the past 6 months.
Oh yeah, I thought a lot about normalization when I was writing my book. There's another essay, not the one on plagues actually, but there's one about compassion fatigue, where I was really kind of responding to the way I was feeling in sort of the first year after the election, where I talked about how, like, you know, I was just tweeting I was reading the news and like tweeting constantly about the news and just reacting all the time. And when people would say something like, stay mad, that would make me so mad, because I was like, how hard is it to stay mad? It's so easy. Like, everything is so infuriating. I couldn't imagine not being mad. And then, you know, fast forward a year or two after that, like, I had to admit that it was hard to stay mad. I was no longer angry all the time. And, you know, thank God in a way, because if you're literally angry all the time, you're probably gonna have a heart attack and like not be able to think clearly, do things that can help your local community, or even just take care of your children or whoever it is you need to take care of yourself. I don't have children, but I try to take care of myself and my partner. And I, like, at some point came to a realization, or not even a conscious realization, but you can rationalize what happens unconsciously, which is that, like, you know, at some point you kind of stop being mad, because it is reality. It's what you're dealing with every single day. So yeah, I mean, this, for most of the past 4 years, it's not like we've been living in a war zone. I've had a job. I haven't had to deal with, you know, really any kind of personal crisis. It's just been knowing so much about what's happening to other people. That's been so, like, oppressive. But yeah, when I was reading about really anything, the Black Death is a great example, but, you know, reading about, you know, people who lived through the Holocaust, or Chernobyl was one that I was really struck by. Just people very quickly were sort of like, oh yeah, like, you move on. And they were very matter of fact and sort of folksy about it. Like, what are you gonna do? Like, you have to do your job. You have to run the farm, you know, whatever it is that you have to do to get through the day. Like, the war, the nuclear disaster, like, sort of becomes background. And that was sort of comforting to me in a way. Like, I felt less guilty about starting to feel like suffering and disaster and crisis were normal, because, you know, I was like, well, my life hasn't changed all that terribly much. There's this great threat all the time, but again, you know, I still have a job. I'm not hungry. So I felt a little less guilty once I realized, like, look, even people in the Holocaust started to feel like that was normal. So it became this question of, like, don't sort of privilege the emotion, like, just try to think through things. Like, you don't have to be angry to be rational about, like, what the right thing to do is. You know, it might even help to kind of think through it calmly. So yeah, I guess all that research helped me have perspective in some way. Yeah, I don't know if I actually answered your question.
No, you did. And it was so comforting to read. Somebody else tweeted today about how comforting it is to read your book right now, and how that was a weird thing to say given the topic of the book. But I felt the same way. I felt like you are speaking to this moment. Yes, you're speaking to history, but you're also speaking to this moment on so many levels. So thank you. Meredith, in Fairest, You write, I didn't actively dislike being a man. It was more that for so much of my life, I lived vicariously through women who were always the central characters in my favorite stories, searching for and finally finding the love of men. It was thrilling to imagine myself living these fantasies, whether in rom-coms or Shakespeare, but especially from great novels set in England. But whenever I finished those books, I had to live with the disappointment that while women in real life had the chance to experience some version of these stories, my pleasure in them was always destined to be indirect. So that one moment when a virtual stranger called me a lady gave me an outsized amount of joy. I love that passage. And seeing as we're all writers here and books are a part of our DNA, can you talk about how some of those novels helped you unravel a different life for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of Fairest as a memoir, one of the things that was really important to me was to question this entire kind of like way that people often portray trans people, which is that somehow we have this sort of like fixed, inexorable identity that, that somehow, like no outside influence would in any way alter, the trajectory of our fate, right? And I just don't believe that, like I think that trans people are certainly a manifestation of the way that the things that we read, the people that we encounter, the things that happen in our lives are things that have enormous effects on us. And in my case, the reading, I have been an avid reader ever since I was a kid. I, I devoured, like many books, and I've always gravitated towards, towards female protagonists. It's just always been a really kind of like huge part of the way of my emotional makeup, right? And I think that, just in terms of, like in terms of those books, then having an influence for me to be able to sort of recognize myself and recognize that I wanted to live in the world in, like in a different form, regardless of how difficult that is, right? Is not actually so unusual, or is not an experience that's unique to trans people. And I think is something that is deeply connected to a lot of the things that we're talking about, right? Like I think, like one of the things, when one of the big experiences that I had throughout this, like this entire, through COVID and through, police brutality, anti-Blackness protests, is a sense of, which was happening, my book published the Tuesday before, like everything erupted around George Floyd and, like all of the protests around the country. And I'm interacting with, we moved 2 hours away from New York City. And one of the most difficult things that I had to experience was the decision not to go into the city. We've only been here in the Catskills for about a year, so my queer people of color community is still there, right? And for such a long time, like I have written essays about this. I wrote about the Women's March in this way, that for such a long time, I've been very frustrated about the ways in which kind of like demonstrations in the United States have been, like, or women, the Women's March there was a lot of discussion around safety and like lack of confrontation. And I grew up in a very different protest tradition in the Philippines, where, like we were very confrontational towards injustice and dictatorships, and, people routinely protested on the streets. And so, this was happening, and I was living around, like immunocompromised people, and the decision not to be there, like even though I participated in protests here, required, like a lot of rethinking about the type of person I am, the type of work that, these questions around what does it mean to be writing and facing a page, at this specific time, right? And sort of like thinking deeply about, like, well, like I have my own, and trying not to do it selfishly, right? Like you've acquired the resources that you've acquired, you've studied the things that you've studied, you've lived the life that you've lived, in part to be able to express the ideas that you have, right? And I feel like there's a way in which I grew into my role as a writer, in a very specific way because of the events of the spring and summer.
Thank you so much for that. Raven, in Luster, I'm trying to hold the book up. Here we go. In Luster, Edie is a young woman who gets involved with a man in an open marriage, and she ends up moving in with the couple. At one point, you describe Edie comparing herself to Rebecca, the wife, and you write, "I feel boring for the compulsion to compare myself to her, and even a little mean, but her serenity bothers me. It bothers me that she doesn't wear prettier underwear, that her marriage is inscrutable and involved, and that I am somewhere inside it." One of the things I love about your novel is how the focus becomes less on Edie and Eric and more on Edie and Rebecca. And in an interview for Bomb, you said, as they draw closer, the conspiracy between them is frustrated by the emotional consequences of that transaction, by the friction of their lived experience. There is a kind of romance in that, maybe perversely, the care they have to take, the fragility of their bond, how often the gratification is delayed and intensified because of the differences they need to reconcile. So I'm wondering, what was it like to unravel the relationship between two women, two very different women sharing the same man? And did you always know you wanted to focus on this aspect, on their relationship?
I did. I mean, I would say the man was more of a delivery system, like I feel like the relationships that interest me most and that I find the most compelling are relationships between women, and the way they are or can be, profound right away and are urgent and are I don't know what the exact word to describe it is, but their relationship is complicated. There is like an eroticism there that is both kind of hindered and stoked by the difference in their lived experience. Rebecca the wife, and I should say, like, coming into this book, writing a book about an open marriage or any sort of like grade of infidelity, I understood there were sort of conventions to that story, and it was important to me to think more critically about it, and to maybe even try and subvert the idea of what we normally see represented for an arrangement like that. The easy thing to do would have been made Rebecca kind of a villain, a scold, as opposed, and like have them fight over this man, as opposed to two serious women who get to let down their masks kind of bit by bit and reveal themselves to each other. And one is a white woman, and she's she's comfortable and a bit fixed and very much in control. And Edie, she's a young Black woman, and she is like kind of more due to the intersection of identities that she lives in. She is out of control, and she lives in a real state of precarity. And like there is, like when we were talking about unraveling, one of the things that I was thinking about was like who's allowed to unravel, right? Like I think lately we've seen online and elsewhere these kind of, I think, meant to be uplifting and sort of inspirational like refrains around Black women specifically saving people and being resilient and strong. And I think that at least, you know, it was important for me to write a Black woman who is afforded the grace to fuck up, you know, and to not even really perhaps know how to save herself. I think that to have depicted her as a sort of stoic and resilient and relentlessly strong person would have been to dehumanize her. And ultimately that's sort of where I was coming from with this relationship, was to have two women sort of showing, you know, slowly bit by bit, showing their private faces to each other, introducing rigor into each other's works, as Edie is an artist. And it really isn't until she develops this relationship with Rebecca, having looked elsewhere in relationships with men for affirmation. But it isn't until she is in this relationship, and it has been true in my life, that the most, I don't know, that most affirmation, the most rigor, the most necessary challenges that I've felt for my work that have made me better have been with other women who are serious about their craft or allowed to be serious. And so in this relationship, I feel like, I'm sorry, I hope I'm answering the question, but in this relationship, you know, it was important for me to have them be fully rendered to, you know, there's a moment in which, you know, because of the nature of the character, you know, she is often dogged by the demand for performance, you know, depending on the room that she's in. And so often on the page and in life, right, you know, you see her interacting with people, but also kind of disassociated, like watching her interactions while she's interacting, kind of hoping that she's projecting the kind of curated image that will be palatable. And in this relationship, it was important for me to have a place where she does a little bit less of that. And it felt very relevant that it would be with another woman who I wanted also to render fully, and not just as like a, you know, unwoke villain, because I think if you start there, there's nowhere to go.
Absolutely. And a quick aside, congratulations on being nominated for the Kirkus Prize, by the way. I know that was just announced this week, so yay!
Thank you.
So I want to ask Natalie now, in Post-Colonial Love Poem, you write such stunning poetry that spans a wide spectrum and includes everything from the body to water to air to desire, basketball, even unicorn horns. And in the first, Water is the Body, in that poem you write, "What threatens white people is often dismissed as myth. I have never been true in America. America is my myth." Can you talk about the myth of America and how you unravel
this country as like being Native, being queer, being Latina as the warp, and the weft is it's kind of this nation's telling. So this nation has control, or believes it has control of the narrative. So, which, as you see, like as the weft comes across, it builds what we see visually, and what we then read as kind of like a story or a narrative. But what's really interesting is that the weft is actually the weakest part. So the weft that's coming across is extremely weak, and it is completely reliant on the warp that's holding these strings that are being woven, or these threads, or these materials that are being woven across. And yet, you know, along that kind of relationship, the warp is like, etymologically, the warp is the thing thrown away, you know, the thing you discard and throw away. And so I think for me, I'm interested in what tension is. You know, I think creativity is actually a tension. I'm, you know, I grew up in a very large family in a 2-bedroom house, 11 kids, my parents and whatever cousins were with us. And so tension and noise and chaos for me are the normal. You know, I think in constellation, I think in collective, collaborative kind of relationships. And, you know, along those lines, one of the tensions that has become a very important place for me to return is and to rethink and reorganize is desire, and what is desire. And for me it is attention. I think desire is not something only human. I believe it's the way a plant might grow, or the way in the desert like a tree might hold water. You know, and imagine, like, we have trees here that know how to hold water for months and months and months. You know, like there's something in the book, but we have wildflowers that literally hide themselves for 20, 30 years. And so imagine, like, you know, imagine the desires we've had where we felt like we might die of those desires. And then to think about the relief, you know. So sometimes the breaking, I mean, it's been really generous to hear all of the different ways we in this conversation are coming at this, because something I've had to do, I've really had to, like, teach myself is that it's not a permission necessarily, but that breaking is very natural. You know, desire, I think, is one way of breaking, and I have to try to reorganize energy so that it's okay for me to break, or it's okay for me. You know, I have troubles in the mornings, and I don't sleep very well, so I have to, like, and I do it with language, because language is one of the ways that I touch, you know, the world. And so I have to, like, voice things that, you know, like, okay, this is anxiety. Well, what if it's something else? Or I don't know what this feeling is, but what if it is, what if it's something I can reorganize and it can move me forward? Or, and importantly, like, what if I can't, you know, and that, so I think I'm thinking back to something Vanessa said earlier about, I think it was right after you said cointo pro. And so, but you said something about the relationship between, like, you said scrutiny, and maybe unraveling and scrutiny. And so I'm thinking about that in terms of, like, tension and relief, tension and relief. And for me, it's like desire and touch, desire and touch, desire and touch. And so I have to kind of, and because I was formerly and maybe mostly an athlete, those tensions for me, I, like, literally, physically, I have to push up against things. Yeah. I have a hard time sitting still without touching things, and I've been trying to, like not do that here on the screen. But yeah, so those are some of the ways I think I'm trying to do that in language on a page. And I'm also really trying to be aware that like, poetry really is just one small part of what language is to me. And so, all that being said, in this moment, since we've been talking about what's happening in this moment, there's a way that I've kind of put poetry and text and writing and creative writing, I've kind of shifted where it exists. And the thing that's been most important to me is, what is that language practice in my home with my lover, and what is that language practice with my parents? And literally, I'm home on my reservation right now, which is a difficult place to be. What is that language practice with my beloveds, who are my friends? And I can trust in that enough, and that I can break in that space, or I can hold off breaking, or I can be there when someone else is breaking. And, you know, it may or may not arrive at the page. But, and so in some ways, I guess I've worked backward from poetry to try to create a practice that does some of what a lot of us have been talking about here, which is to, like, exist somehow, you know, like to sit here and say, I feel my shoulders. which is because I'm a little bit anxious and a little bit uncomfortable, and yet somehow that's also a lucky thing, you know, to be able to feel that. But again, that was a really generous question, and it's one I will continue to think about. So, gracias.
Thank you so much. It was a beautiful response. So, Vanessa, I'm going to hold up your book now. In the Great Offshore Grounds, one of my favorite passages is this one. You write, "Some ships navigate by charts and landmarks, piloting through understanding the larger picture and their place within it. Other vessels have to rely on dead reckoning. They know only where they came from and how long it took to arrive at this moment in time. From this, they can try to make the thousands of minute calculations and course corrections necessary to reach the shore." Can you talk about how you navigated writing this novel, a book that deals with both familial and American history and ghosts? Was there a fair amount of dead reckoning involved in writing this?
Yes, there's definitely a lot of dead reckoning involved. Navigation in general comes through the book because I was fascinated with it as a historical tool in many ways. I mean, there are different, I started looking at whale navigation and finding that there are whales that navigate, is a little less, I won't get nerdy on that. There are whales that navigate in one particular way, and whales that navigate a little bit in a different way. So one is, they might be following electromagnetic resources or sonar, or I saw parallels in this idea of, do you navigate by bouncing something, by just going, okay, I'm here and that's right there. Like I'm here and that's right there, whatever that is. Or do you navigate by memory? You've been here before, you came as a calf or something with your mom, and your instinct is bringing you back, but it's not just your instinct. Or do you, and so those different things I began to think about a lot, writing about, American myth. I have the great big problems with it, and as a totalizing thing. And I started thinking about, how do we judge what progress looks like in this country? How do we judge it? Do we judge it from how far we are from one particular action, thing, or place? Do we judge it by what we should be and could be? Do we guide by what is familiar? Or do we reassess it every moment and correct it every moment, to say, okay, moving forward, and all of those things were part of my way of finding a language to talk about American history and choices and the discomfort I feel with a lot of that and not knowing how to navigate it. With the Dead Reckoning, in terms of writing and the process around writing it, it was a hard book for me to write. It took a really long time for a variety of reasons. And I start writing by free writing dialogue. I do a lot of free writing. I don't plan things out. I don't want to know. I really write very, very, very far into books before I have any idea about how they might land. And part of that is just creating the stamina to do novels, right? Which is, I know there will come a time when I am sick to death of it, and I still have to continue if it is ever going to come into the world. And so keeping all my curiosity alive is part of the stamina of how I get through finishing, right? Like if I don't know what's going to happen, I'm interested, and I'll try to keep going. The other side of that is, you don't know if you're going to land. You don't know if you're going to get there. It is totally, totally possible. And it was very possible with this novel to go all the way out into the ocean. And the dead reckoning you're following is not there. And in fact, that happened in this novel, in the writing of it. I ended up, going through a lot of changes with it. I had to move publisher. I mean, like a lot of things happened in the course of writing it, internally and externally. In part, it definitely hit a point where I just came apart, speaking of unraveling, because I had believed so fervently that this was the novel I wanted to write. And I trusted my artistic instinct, and I'm good at trusting my instincts. And I felt like all of my instincts had betrayed me. I felt like I had put 100% into it. I trusted it blindly, and I was now looking at something where I was totally lost, and all my and that was the most frightening thing, was if I can't trust my artistic instinct, I never want to write again. Like, I don't want someone to give it to me. I don't want someone to reflect it to me. you know, and so that being lost is very much part of the book. It's very much part of my experience writing the book, and that dead reckoning of constant correction. I think the thing about dead reckoning, which is the sort of final retreat of sailors, right, is the only thing you have left when you're really, really, like, if you know, you have the stars, you have, I mean, there are various things, but on a cloudy night, you know, on any other thing, it's that speed. I know how fast I was going. I know where I started, you know, and I'm gonna make that calculation. And so that's the way in which it, you know, I took it in the novel and took it while I was writing it. I also want to say one more thing, just back on very quickly. You know, we're talking about in the very beginning of this conversation about that sort of outrage and fatigue or various things. And I know that there's a lot of fear, and has been for a lot of legitimate reasons, about normalizing things, you know, and if we do this, and there's so much outrage that's just performative, frankly, and exhausting and performative. And then there's outrage that isn't all of that, but it's okay to normalize resilience too. It's okay to normalize surviving things as well, and not just normalize. I mean, what I mean is, it's not just the absence of something, right? It's not just the absence of outrage, it's the presence of resilience. It's the presence of other things coming forward as well.
I love that. I love that. I have so many other questions I want to ask you guys, but we're running out of time, and I want to ask a few of the audience questions here because a bunch of people have submitted some. So one of them is, while yes, 2020 feels much like a great unraveling, what would a great re-raveling mean for you look like? Is it desirable? Does anyone want to answer that?
Not the same thread.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I'm an avid knitter. I've been a knitter for a long time. And one of the things that I think about a lot is the process of when you unravel something, you know, like the yarn is like stretched and curly, and you have to really kind of like process it again. You know, you have to soak it and you have to dry it. You have to do all of these loving things to be able to sort of rebuild, right? And I think about that a lot in terms of, you know, like how we can actually, and as society as a whole, you know, that when we think about like what it means to be back to normal, it's really important for us to, you know, for us to situate that normal as different from, you know, the normal that we had before the pandemic, before you know, before the protests, right? And that's been something that I've really been challenging myself to do, because it's so easy to, you know, like fall back into patterns of behavior, because, you know, because these are, you know, kind of like, it's so much easier for things to want to do things the way that you've been doing them before.
I think that's so true. Yeah. Does anyone else have anything they want to add to that?
I'll just add, it's definitely not going back to the past, because I mean, this pandemic, just for example, like, you know, was what made all of the problems that were already existing like worse, you know, just like potholes. There's a big storm and these are all the potholes. So it's trying to look towards, you know, something more like the more functional countries in the world. Like, I think, you know, the one positive thing that this pandemic has done is shown how like these other models are better, clearly. Like, there's working ways to deal with a problem like this. It's not like it's just like, it's all madness, oh my God, we're dinosaurs and an asteroid just hit. It's like a lot of countries actually had systems that were sort of built to withstand such a giant crisis, and with damage, but minimal damage. And, you know, obviously we've had like maximal damage. So to me, it's like, rebuild in a completely new building. Don't just try to recreate the facade from before the bombing or whatever.
Right. Yeah. Here's another audience question. I'd love to know how everyone's writing practice is going now. What are you writing or working on? Who's a full-time writer? Anyone else have to have a job in addition to writing?
I have a job. I have a full-time job. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I write all the time, but yeah, not for my job, at night, on the weekends. My practice right now, I'm trying to write a book of poetry again, just going back to like something that's completely sentences out of my head that don't have to be fact checked by anyone. It's a little bit comfort zone, but for me, it's like philosophy.
So yeah, I want to jump in. I spent 8 years just writing for a living, and that was a $16,000 to $20,000, $24,000 a year job for me. That's very different for different people, but I think talking about money and what money really looks like doesn't happen a lot in the arts, and so I'm just being really transparent about it. And you have to weigh out, I had to weigh out at times how much of my creativity is going into having to hustle weird, maybe it's nonfiction or other things that I'm doing, that then it goes away from the main medium that I want or another form of that. But then I also chose very specifically, because of what's happening in the country, to go back into something I did 15 years ago, was work as a labor organizer. And I'm going to say, I'm not writing, because I know and I understood that was not going to be possible in this job right now. And so we make real choices as writers, and they're not easy sometimes, because, and I think it depends on the format and the medium you're writing in sometimes, whether it's longer work, whether it's you're at a generative stage. So I would take seriously, I'm throwing it out there just because I think there's a lot of judgment around how work goes in relationship to writing. And I think there's a lot of, everybody's got to find their own way, and finding a way that works around your process that you can survive and stand, and I don't mean that stand as an emotional thing. I mean more like, I'm a morning writer, and so I always took evening and grave shift. Mm-hmm. There's different balances, but yeah, that's all I was going to say, is just numbers down.
Yeah, I'm deep into a novel. I forget who it was who advised me to just at least start a project before you publish your book, because it can be really hard to get momentum going if you don't have kind of a project in mind. And I think I am one of those people who deals with my anxiety and all of the chaos that's happening in my world through writing. So I'm doing that. And yeah, I completely agree with Vanessa in terms of, figuring out, I've always sought in quote unquote interesting jobs, right? Because I always feel like they would give me a certain kind of life experience. And also I've always strived to be as freelance as possible. I have occasionally been lured into full-time jobs, and my fallback work is as a Tagalog translator, which is actually simultaneously, it's me exercising my native language, but is also pretty interesting. So I'm pretty lucky that way.
That's great.
Yeah, I actually haven't written in a while, which is very strange for me, because I also feel like that is generally how it's not therapy, but it's just more how I process and how if I'm not writing, I don't feel like I'm fully present. But so I haven't been writing for a bit, and I've been painting more, which is the first thing that I ever did, and loved. And that side of my brain is just kind of on right now. And I don't know why, but that is, that's how I'm getting out that energy for work. That also is really important to me. This is actually the first time that I'm writing full time, and that happened last year. Otherwise, this book that is in the world now, like I wrote while I had a full-time job, an office job, an open office plan, which is horrible. And I was at school full-time. I was pursuing my MFA. So when I wrote, it was really after the 9 to 5, and it was after class, and I just carved out a certain window at night, every night, to write, and then the weekends. And that's most of the writing I've done was after the 9 to 5, and they were all office jobs. You know, I had great teachers who told me, if you want to do this thing, try and find a job that will feed you, but also leave you enough energy, like generative energy, to do the thing at night. So they tended to be jobs that that I wanted to do well, but didn't have like an emotional stake in as much, you know. But yeah, right now, it's a bit strange. It's the first time I'm full time as a writer, and I feel the incredible privilege of that.
What about you, Natalie?
My mute button, so nobody has to say the dreaded "you're on mute." And regarding working,
yeah, and what you're working on for writing, and yeah, whether you have a job.
Yeah, I feel like in some ways I'm always working on things. Maybe not necessarily writing, or maybe to my detriment, or maybe as a lucky thing, I've mostly been writing things that have been asked of me as to think alongside somebody, or some sort of like, not necessarily commission, but like, hey, we're doing this, and would you like to contribute something? Or I feel like I've been a lot, I guess maybe I should say this, like the way I come to poetry is not necessarily through poetry. So I come through the image in some ways. And so I've been doing a lot of collaborative work, or work with, museums and things on like the moving image, for example. And it's not necessarily new, and I don't know that I would consider it work per se, but it's the way my imagination works. So it arrives at the page as this, but before the page, it's all these like possibilities. Something new in my life is that I'm in academia now, and it's an extremely lucky job to be in. That I still have a paycheck. I'm at a university that values, quote, innovation and imagination, all these keywords. I mean, I run the Center for Imagination in the Borderlands of all things. And I think in some ways it's that, I guess, Raven, the advice you got about something that can feed you and also feed you, right? Like it can feed you, it can literally feed you at the table, but it can also you have this energy that can feed your creativity. I think I'm in that space of negotiating what is work and what is labor. Yeah, and Vanessa, like this idea, or not an idea, but this move of coming back to labor organization, and this is something I try to talk with my students about, but I really do. I mean, poetry is a very powerful thing, but to me, it feels like the place before an other action. Or the place before a possible action. And language, I think, is something like that, right? Like there are bodies before the language, and then there are actions of those bodies that might take place after that language. And so, we've heard the word lost pulled up, or in many different variations of words. And I feel like I'm in a place of reassessment and reorganization about what is possible within the academy, what is possible within the scope of poetry, versus what I know is possible in language that exists outside of either of those. And so I'm thinking a lot about, about that kind of labor. Right now I'm going sideways, which I tend to do often. In terms of my work, all of the projects in front of me right now are very much visual projects. So lots of short films and moving image things. So